Welcome to Unregistered Live, where we present to the world some of the work that we are doing at Unregistered Academy in our courses. Tonight, I will be discussing, let's remove Plato, what I'd say most scholars of Western philosophy and Western thought agree, I think this is a consensus, has been possibly the foundational principle or concept in Western culture since roughly antiquity, since the time of the ancient Greek philosophers, which is the mind-body duality, sometimes called the mind-body binary. The idea that the human soul is made up of fundamentally two parts that are antagonistic and serve contrary purposes. And we're going to look at this tonight, the history of it in the original texts where this doctrine or set of ideas was first developed in the ancient Greek philosophy, in particular in Plato's Republic specifically, and then most especially in Christian theology. And we're going to look at the origins of the idea of a mind and a body being at odds with each other in the Bible. And these sections have been taken from two of our courses at Unregistered Academy. You can see them in the description. You can go look at them. One is our course on Plato's Republic, which is part of our Great Books series. And the other is our course that begins next week as a live course on the Bible. Now, the occasion for this live stream and the reason I chose this subject today is that Jordan Peterson, I think just 2 days ago, gave a talk in London at a major conference. I think it's called the ARC conference, in which he presented for about a half an hour the thesis that Western civilization has been built on an ethic of sacrifice, self-sacrifice, since its origins, since antiquity. And that is, from my reading of Western history, from my understanding of Western culture and the traditions of it, is fundamentally, profoundly correct. Now, I've been a critic of many aspects of Jordan Peterson's career, but I've also been a fan of many things he said. And this is one of them. Now, there's two things, though, that he's saying. One is the analysis of Western culture, in which he posits that, as I said, an ethic of self-sacrifice, which comes from, as you will see, the Western notion of Western notions of the mind and body. So the analysis that has been at the center of Western culture for 2,500 years at least, I fully agree with. Now, he has a politics as well regarding the mind-body duality, the ethic of self-sacrifice. These are concepts also known as, and we'll talk about this in a moment, asceticism. Asceticism. The doctrine of self-sacrifice for a greater good, usually meaning a communal good. Sacrifice one's own desires, pleasures, freedom, and interests, and body for the greater communal good, which can be defined as either God's community or the nation state, or even just your local town. People have sacrificed literally their bodies. Think of police officers and firefighters for the town that they live in, right? So that is the doctrine of asceticism, which directly comes from the Western conception of the mind and body being fundamentally at odds. So let's begin at the beginning, which is when we see this concept of the mind and body being two separate and antagonistic parts of the human soul. We see that formulated for the first time as a doctrine in Plato's thinking, in particular in Plato's Republic, which is, everyone agrees, every scholar agrees, is the most important of all of his books. And I have been teaching Plato's Republic now for almost 30 years. And to this day, as you will see tonight, the questions raised in that book have been and continue to be the central questions in Western political thought, in Western philosophy, in Western culture. And to me and many scholars, I'm not unusual in saying this, to me and to many scholars of the history, the broad history of Western thought, this concept of the mind-body duality has been central and fundamental and primary to this day. And we'll talk about the implications of it politically and otherwise after we look at the actual foundational texts of this idea. So it begins, as I said, with Plato, in particular, Plato's Republic. So Plato, of course, was a philosopher, ancient Greek philosopher. He was a student of Socrates, and there's a debate about whether his ideas were actually his own or whether they were just taken from Socrates. It's immaterial for our purposes tonight. He was born in 424 BC and lived until 347 BC. He founded an academy in Athens. And as I said, he wrote the Republic, Plato's Republic, in 375 BC. So that's what we're going to be talking about first, is a section in Plato's Republic in which he introduces the idea of the mind and the body being separate and being oppositional to one another. So he introduces this concept in, as I said, Plato's Republic. This is the edition we'll be quoting from. So if you want to take the course to get the full analysis of this foundational text in Western history, and again, this is unanimous among all scholars of Western history, to understand the world that we live in now in the West today in 2025, you must begin with this book. So here's just tonight, as I said, this is just one small piece of the course on Plato's Republic at the Academy, but this is relevant to our topic tonight. So on page 115, 439C, Socrates, and the Plato's Republic is written as a set of dialogues between Socrates and his various interlocutors. Plato is essentially just conveying the teachings of Socrates through these set pieces of dialogue. So in this particular dialogue, Socrates says to his adversary, his opponent, Glaucon, he says, "Now, would we assert that sometimes there are thirsty people who don't wish to drink?" Just think about that. Have you ever been thirsty but chose not to drink water? Glaucon says, "Certainly, it happens often to many different people. What then should one say about them? Isn't it that there is something in their soul bidding them to drink, and something different?" This is Socrates. "And something different forbidding them to do so that overrules the thing that bids?" I would imagine everyone listening right now can relate to this. How many times have you had some kind of desire for a thing, but have repressed that desire in the moment to serve a better and different function and purpose? How often does that happen? I would suggest that it happens every second of every day, that we are all constantly repressing, pushing aside desires for things of all kinds of things, so that we can get work done, so that we can go to school, so that we can take care of our family, so that we can do things, right? We can't, to function as human beings in this physical world, it's simply a matter of physics almost, that we have to repress all those many desires for things like leisure, take a break, go see a movie, play a video game instead of working. Desires for sex, that's a big one. People are repressing their desires for sex all the time, at least most psychiatrists and psychologists say this, or at least much of the time, so that they can function. Desire for food. Desire for food. How often do we repress our desire for food? So that we can be healthier, more athletic, better looking, whatever, right? This is this constant interplay, I believe, in everyone's mind, pretty much everyone's mind, all the time. Because in our minds, I would imagine this is correct for everyone listening, or almost everyone listening, we have desirous thoughts that pop up in our minds almost randomly, but fairly constantly. So the act of repression is a form of eternal vigilance. So let's go back to this statement by Socrates, the third paragraph here. He says, Socrates, what then should one say about those people who repress those desires to drink when they're thirsty? He says, isn't it that there is something in their soul bidding them to drink, and something different forbidding them to do so, that overrules the thing that bids? And what he's about to do is introduce this concept of the mind being the vehicle of discipline and order, self-restraint, sacrifice, rationality, that is always attempting to counteract, and often is able to counteract and contain and control the desirous thoughts that emerge from what he is now calling our body. The mind is what controls and represses and sublimates and channels all of these base primal desires for things like leisure and food and drink and sex. The mind is where discipline is. So continue here. He says, I think so, Socrates says. Then he says, doesn't that which forbids in such cases come into play, if it comes into play at all, as a result of rational calculation, while what drives and drags them to drink is a result of feelings and diseases? Okay, so the mind now is where rational calculation is. Rationality, as opposed to feelings, emotions, whim. The body is what drives us to want to drink, and the body is the vehicle of feelings, which of course are not irrational. They're undisciplined, they're unconstrained, they're almost like wild animals inside of us. And of course, Freud, couple thousand years later, described this similarly, that he called the desires of the body the id, and he called the rational, controlling, disciplining mind civilization. Civilization, as Jordan Peterson himself just said, requires this kind of what I'm calling repression. We simply can't build roads and bridges. We can't have hospitals and schools. We can't have the internet and computers. We can't have the rule of law. We can't have law at all unless our rational mind counteracts and suppresses or represses the desires emanating out of the body, which are constant for probably most people. Then he says, apparently, hence it isn't unreasonable for us to claim that they are two and different from one another, two different parts of the human soul. Plato is putting forward this idea that the human soul is actually divided between these two fundamentally different and, as I said, antagonistic parts, the mind and the body. We'll call the part of the soul with which it calculates the rational part, and the part with which it lusts, hungers, thirsts, and gets excited by other appetites, the irrational, appetitive appetites part, which is a companion of certain indulgences and pleasures. He's not just talking about sex, right? But sex is a big part of it. All of those desires that are for bodily pleasure, food, drink, rest, leisure, fun, and sex, that's the problem. Plato is identifying that as the problem in building a civilization, in building his republic. We simply can't have nice things of any kind unless people constrain, repress, and channel what Freud called the id. And to that, Jordan Peterson and I agree that civilization, at least as we know it in the modern age, absolutely could not have been built without massive, widespread repression of these desires. He finishes by saying, yes, indeed, that's a reasonable thing to think. So let's look at this a little more clearly. This is the mind-body duality as I conceive of it, as introduced by Plato, and then later, as we'll see, in the Bible. The mind is the place where reason, rationality, discipline, self-control, work, and order. You know, Jordan Peterson often talks about the sort of archetypal masculine mission to impose order on chaos. That idea comes from this, the mind-body duality. Order is in the mind. Chaos is in the body. In the body, we have desire, appetite, feelings, sex, leisure, and, as I said, chaos. And so for Sigmund Freud, for me, and for Jordan Peterson, and I would say for the vast, vast majority of thinkers in the Western philosophical tradition, civilization, the civilization that we know in the West, absolutely has always perpetually required the mind controlling the body. The mind, in the idea of the mind-body duality in Western discourse, is superior to the body. Reason and rationality are superior, better than desire and appetite and feelings. Discipline and self-control are better, are superior to sex and leisure. Order is superior to chaos. Work is superior to rest. So those are value judgments. And I leave that to you to decide where you stand. Now, it would be, I think, silly to take the side wholly of either the mind or the body. And as I say in A Renegade History of the United States, in which I lay out this concept as it applied to the founding of the United States of America, if we take the side entirely of the mind, if all the people in our society live according to the mind, reason, rationality, discipline, self-control, all that, we will live in a society in which the roads are beautiful, the bridges are perfect, the internet works fabulously, everyone obeys the law, there is no crime, everybody works in productive enterprises all day, every day, and we build and build and build and build and get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier and more powerful and more powerful. But imagine that world in which all the things that are represented by the body according to this system of thought are left out, repressed, eliminated, silenced. Some people do want to live in that society, which, by the way, was imagined by progressive thinkers and some socialist thinkers and some fascist thinkers about 100 years ago in a movement called futurism, which was a precursor to a lot of Silicon Valley contemporary thinking about the world. And you can find elements of futurism in Elon Musk's thinking and Peter Thiel's thinking, in the thinking of many of the leaders of Silicon Valley, in which in the future, all human beings will have their minds trained, maybe by machines, but at least trained to be of the mind, productive, disciplined, orderly, efficient at all times. So imagine that world. I mean, maybe you do prefer that, and that's just a value judgment, which there is no correct answer to. I leave that up to you. Then the body. Imagine a society in which all people are given to what is defined as the body. They follow the demands of desire, of appetite, of feelings, of sexual desire. They follow the demands of the body to rest, to have leisure, to have fun. They live in chaos. They purvey chaos because they have little to no ability to impose order on their own minds and their own souls, and therefore they're unable to impose order of any kind on the society at large. That, as I say in A Renegade History of the United States in the introduction, would result in a society of nightmares, terror, crime, absolute insecurity. Nothing's being built, nothing's being developed. Poverty would ensue. Poverty and crime and chaos if all people were of the body. But if all people were of the mind, it looks like a dystopian science fiction future where everyone essentially acts like robots. And so what do we do with this enormous fundamental question about how to be, how to think, what to do with our minds, with our bodies every day? So I love the question, and philosophers, as I said, since Plato have been dealing with this question. But in the West, there's been a nearly unanimous take on it among the major philosophers, I would say, with the exception of perhaps Nietzsche and Foucault. And we have courses on Nietzsche and Foucault at the Academy, which you should take. But generally speaking, most Western philosophers, the great Western philosophers who really laid the foundation for the culture that we live in today, have agreed that the mind is superior and should be valorized and celebrated over the body. And also that certain people, this has been posited, especially in the modern era, certain social groups, and we can all think about social groups in American history that have been historically associated with the mind, whether correctly or not, that doesn't matter. But historically, it has been thought in America that certain social groups are of the mind and other social groups are of the body. Let's just take a moment and think about who those might be, which social groups in American discourse and American thinking have been associated with one or the other, right? So the most obvious, I would think, is that historically, white people have been associated with the mind in America in general, and Black people have been associated with the body. I don't think I need to spell that out too much, but if you think about what African American culture has been famous for in terms of its successes, it's what it has produced. It is things like music, entertainment, comedy, dance, food, slang. All fantastic, wonderful things, and I would leave the United States if they didn't exist here. But white people then have been associated, of course, with NASA, the moon landing, the theory of relativity, nuclear science, science in general, rational thought, not dancing. White people, of course, are infamous in our culture for not being able to dance. Very odd. People that might seem trivial and silly, but it's actually quite fundamental. Those who have been considered good dancers in American history have been considered to be of the body and therefore inferior groups. It's not just blacks. So Jews, before they assimilated during World War II, also were associated with the body, dancing, sex, pleasure, leisure, etc. Jews in America before World War II were known for being jazz singers, jazz dancers, actors, performers, Yiddish theater, Al Jolson, the jazz singer, pornography, the pornographic industry in America was founded by Jews in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These were people of the body, quite clearly, at least then, which is odd. Now we think of Jews as accountants and professors. But no, not then. Italians, even more so, considered to be of the body when they first arrived in America. Again, they were some of the founders of jazz. Many of the first jazz bands were Italian in New Orleans in the 1910s and 20s. The Irish before then in the early 19th century were considered to be of the body entirely, chaotic people who drank all the time and fornicated all the time. Didn't work, were lazy. Then, of course, the Irish in America later assimilated and sort of proved themselves as a group to be good, disciplined, orderly American citizens. But for a long time, they were identified with the body. You can think of other social groups that have been identified with one or the other category here. How about gays, homosexuals? Until recently, and maybe even still recently, but certainly until recently, they, of course, were always identified with the body, because homosexual sex can only be recreational. It can never be procreational. So by their own definition, homosexuals are of the body, of desire, of appetite, of feelings, etc. Women, again, historically, I'm not talking about what is true or not. I'm talking about how women have been discussed in American discourse, have been also usually generally associated with, of course, the body. Women are unable to think in rational, disciplined ways. They act and think like children. Again, this is historically what has been said about women. And they tend to operate according to their feelings, their emotions, which is why Jordan Peterson and many others have said that the feminine archetype has always represented chaos, and the masculine archetype has always represented order. Men have been considered to be associated with the mind, generally speaking, discipline, control, and order. So what do you do? What I suggest is that all of us, or perhaps almost all of us, possess both sets of feelings and inclinations inside of us all the time, and they are always at war with each other. Imagine your alarm clock when it goes off in the morning. That is the moment when this fight between the mind and the body takes place. The first moment of consciousness is when it starts every day. Do you get out of bed and go to work? Or do you turn off that alarm clock and go back to bed and continue sleeping? Does the mind win in this moment, this particular fight between the two, or does the body win? If the mind wins, what do you gain? Well, you do work, you presumably gain money from that, wealth, and the good life and all the things associated with it. So obvious benefits to going with the mind. If you go with the body, turn off your alarm clock, go back to bed, you won't gain anything materially, of course. Society will not gain at all from this, but your body will be happy in that moment while you're sleeping. which many people consider to be insignificant. There are many people who are true ascetics, and not just monks, but many people, as I'm sure we all know, live most of their life in a very orderly, disciplined way, and they devote most of their life to work, to productive work. So what do we do with this question when it comes to politics? Whose side do we take? The people and the moments that have been associated with the mind, or the people and the moments that have been associated with the body? And this is a difficult question always, but again, think about what your values are. Don't think about morality, what is morally correct. I prefer that we think about what we value as individuals and how much we value them, and then weigh those values against other values. How much do we value what the body represents versus how much do we value what the mind represents? And how do we negotiate that conflict, which I think Plato rightly identified as a real conflict. So this idea of the mind and body being separate and antagonistic, and of the mind being the thing that controls the body, was, as I'm suggesting here, essentially invented by Plato. But it really took hold as a doctrine and became and was disseminated broadly across the world as a doctrine by Christians. In particular, this guy, Paul, the Apostle Paul, who wrote many parts of the New Testament, but most importantly, I think most people agree, is the book in the Bible called the Epistle to the Romans, which is Paul's epistle to the Romans, a letter he wrote to the Romans. It's otherwise just known as Romans, this book in the Bible, in which he very powerfully and clearly introduces and expands Plato's idea of the mind-body duality, and in which it becomes a doctrine of asceticism. Asceticism. So this is Romans chapter 5, verses 1 through 5. He says, therefore, this is Paul, therefore, since we are justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have obtained access to this grace in which we stand. And we boast in our hope of sharing the glory of God. And not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings. We boast in our sufferings. That's a classic statement of asceticism. Suffering, depredation is actually now valued and valorized. It is a source of virtue. One is virtuous now if one chooses to suffer, to sacrifice oneself, one's own comfort for some greater good. Knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. Okay, so the doctrine of, as Jordan Peterson said this week, self-sacrifice is implanted here. It is first disseminated in the New Testament, in the Bible. And since then, over the last 2,000 years, it has become internalized in the minds of most Westerners. The vast majority of Westerners have this internalized in our minds, that to suffer, to sacrifice for some greater good, again, for God or for nation or for family, is always virtuous. When we hear to this day, and always, when we hear somebody, some person sacrifice their freedom, their pleasure, their desires to help their family, their community, their nation, or the world, we elevate them to the highest status of heroism, do we not? That is the doctrine of asceticism. I'm not here to say that it's wrong at all. I'm here to ask all of you watching to choose and to think about how you will now negotiate these ideas, because it is a constant daily civil war, I believe, in almost everyone's mind. Should I get up and work or should I stay in bed? A war between the mind and the body. In Romans 6, chapter 6, verses 12 through 19, he says, "Do not let sin exercise dominion in your mortal bodies to make you obey their passions." Passions is another word for what we've been talking about in the body. Feelings, pleasures, desires. That's passions. "No longer present your members to sin as instruments of wickedness." And by the way, members, it depends on your edition of the Bible, but members has generally been interpreted to mean, yes, sexual organs. "No longer present your members to sin as instruments of wickedness, but present yourselves to God as those who have been brought from death to life, and present your members to God as instruments of righteousness." Clear, crystal clear statement of asceticism. Sacrifice your members and what they represent, sacrifice them to God, and remake them as instruments of righteousness. Then he says, "For sin will have no dominion over you, since you are not under law, but under grace. What then? Should we sin because we are not under law, but under grace? By no means. Do you not know that if you present yourselves to anyone as obedient slaves, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin, which leads to death, or of obedience, which leads to righteousness? But thanks be to God that you, having once been slaves of sin," you were of the body, "have become obedient from the heart to the form of teaching to which you were entrusted, and that you, having been set free from sin, have become slaves of now righteousness. I am speaking in human terms because of your natural limitations. For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity," think about what we now call sex addiction. People, it is thought, who can't control themselves, they just must watch porn all the time, or they must have sex all the time, or that's all they think about all the time. That's the kind of person he's referring to here. "For just as you once presented your members as slaves to impurity and to greater and greater iniquity, so now present your members as slaves to righteousness for sanctification." Sacrifice your members to God and for God. That is asceticism. Chapter 7, verses 21 to 25. "So I find it to be a law that when I want to do what is good, evil lies close at hand. For I delight in the law of God in my inmost self, but I see in my members another law at war with the law of my mind, making me captive to the law of sin that dwells in my members." There is, as I said, a war, a civil war in our minds. And again, I think this actually describes quite well the inner workings of my mind, and I think the inner workings of most people's minds. A constant battle between the desire to sin and the desire to be righteous. "Wretched man that I am, who will rescue me from this body of death?" Sin, bodily desires represent death. To live in sin, to practice, exercise desires, bodily desires, is to live a life of death. Then he says, "Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then with my mind, I am a slave now to the law of God, but with my flesh, I am a slave to the law of sin." So the mind, order, rationality, discipline are also the vehicle, the avenue to reach God and godliness. We go to God, we become godly through our rational mind. This is where Christianity amplifies Plato's idea of the mind being the source of virtue. Finally, in Romans, this is chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. "I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice." meaning present your desires, your pleasures, your freedom, your own self-interest. Present all of that to God, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, and world in this sense in the New Testament and in Christian theology generally refers to worldliness, which refers to, again, the pleasures of the flesh, material pleasures, things that are not spiritual of God. But be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you may discern what is the will of God. Again, the rational mind is necessary to understand how to be godly. And it will cause you to understand at the end here what is good and acceptable and perfect. As I said, this is the doctrine of asceticism derived from or taking a particular position on the mind-body duality question. Asceticism is defined by the dictionary as the practice of strict self-denial as a measure of personal and especially spiritual discipline, the condition, practice, or mode of life of an ascetic, rigorous abstention from self-indulgence. So, when a rapper or an e-girl is criticized by those who are the keepers of morality as being chaotic and bad for society, you might want to think about it anew now with this information. You might still choose to castigate the e-girl or the porn star, those who are apparently given to the body. But you also might now think this has all been a giant social construction that has no basis in truth, no absolute truth. It could be right in that it serves the function of civilization, the purposes of civilization, which I agree it does. But will we always be, and again, this is an open question. I don't have an answer. This is according to your values. Will we always, do you want to always be on the side of civilization, order, discipline, rationality, repression against the pleasures of the body? And if you favor more, you're sympathetic more to the pleasures of the body, to what extent? Will you get up when the alarm clock goes off in the morning tomorrow? Or will you stay in bed? So it's a constant balance. There is no one answer. Jordan Peterson politically takes the side, at least rhetorically, from what I've heard, entirely of the mind and of order and of discipline and of rationality, and never speaks anything positive of what the body presents to us, offers to us. I don't think he fully believes that, but that's certainly the rhetoric that comes out of him. So his analysis, I agree with, about the relationship between self-sacrifice and the growth of Western civilization, no doubt about it. This kind of repression was necessary always to build what we now have in Europe and America. But is that all? Is that the end of the story? Because, of course, we know that many, many, many bodily desires have been repressed, many times brutally, by the power of the state. And we now think, in many cases, that was unnecessary, maybe even superstitious, and in itself irrational. Take prohibition. The prohibition on alcohol in the United States in the 1920s. We now basically universally agree that that was a bad idea that produced a lot of unneeded, unnecessary, terroristic repression. And now we all drink, and we've been drinking since the 1930s. The drug war, prohibitions on drugs, good or bad, necessary or not. How do we balance that? But think about in your own life, in your own mind, every day. I submit to you, you might now be thinking differently about how you move through the day, that you're always balancing the two. Obligations, responsibilities, what a good citizen, a good person, a good parent, a good student, a good teacher do, or what we really want to do deep inside of us. Would we rather work or go to the beach? It's always there. This interplay is always there. And what I'm submitting to you is that that fight between the mind and the body, as Westerners have conceived it, the outcome of that fight among countless millions and millions of people over 2,000 years has determined the precise shape of the civilization we live in today. And with that, I suggest that you all take a look at our website, and in particular, these two courses, Plato's Republic at Unregistered Academy, and then starting next week, live course on the Bible. And we'll be having multiple guest speakers, professional theologians, Bible scholars of various different perspectives who will give us their take, their interpretation of this central part in the history of Western civilization. And with that, I thank you. Hope to see you all next week. Hope to see many of you in class at unregisteredacademy.com. Thank you very much. See you next week. Bye-bye.